start here with a question for Dr. Craig.
Is this on? Okay, hi. I think we have a war over background evidence. You enter in natural theology, and then Dr. Carrier enters in cognitive science in talking about hallucinations. So in this war of background evidence, how exactly do you weigh what takes the weight in terms of what data that we should expect from if God wanted to reveal himself to us?
Well, is mine on? Hello? Okay. With respect to the existence of God, if the arguments of natural theology do establish that God exists, then the probability of the resurrection relative to our background information is going to depend crucially on the probability that this God would want to raise Jesus from the dead. Now, it seems to me that given what we know of Jesus' own radical personal claims, his claim to be the revelation of God the Father, his miracle working, his exorcisms, and so forth, the skeptic just isn't in a position to say justifiably that it is improbable that God would want to raise Jesus from the dead. And so I don't think that you can say that relative to our background knowledge, it's improbable that God would raise Jesus from the dead. Now, when then you add in all of the evidence that I've suggested, then I think that raises the probability that God raised him from the dead very high. Now, I would want to include all the cognitive science that you mentioned relative to hallucinations. You notice I did not deny that the disciples could have hallucinated. I don't know how one would show something like that. But what I argued was that hallucinations cannot explain all of the facts. They can't explain, well, the diversity of the various appearances, and that even if they had hallucinated, it wouldn't have led to belief in Jesus' resurrection. So I'm willing to go the mile with the hallucination theory and grant, okay, let's grant they had hallucinations. Will that still meet those criteria I laid out? And I think on a number of counts, the hallucination theory fails. If you want to look at this in more detail, look at my book that was mentioned with Gerhard Ludemann. He defends a hallucination theory, and I go into this in great detail in that book as to why I think it doesn't meet these 6 criteria.
Over here.
Is it on? Okay. First of all, I want to thank you guys. You guys gave us a free lunch. So, Dr. Carrier, I want to ask a question, and my assumption is that you assume that the Gospels are basically myth-making. If I'm wrong on that, you can address that too. But I'm curious, since you bring up the issue of, Simon of Cyrene and the Lazarus issue, how do you explain the fact that Simon of Cyrene is stated by Mark to be the father of Rufus and Alexander? Because you only focus on Simon of Cyrene, but in Mark's context, it's talking about Rufus and Alexander as Simon's kids. How does that play into your myth idea? And then the idea of also John's Lazarus and Luke's Lazarus. Luke gives it as a parable, and John gives him as a historical person in Bethany. How do you, I don't see the correlation between those two.
Yeah, I'll take the last one first. As I was arguing, John is actually inventing the historical Lazarus using the fictional character, and in doing that is commenting on Luke's use of the parable. And one reason we can conclude this is the fact that this Lazarus character doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels. Here we have in the last Gospel of John, we've never heard of a historical Lazarus, despite the fact that Jesus supposedly rose him from the dead, despite the fact that he was supposedly beloved by Jesus, despite the fact that he was supposedly at the empty tomb, despite the fact that he supposedly saw Jesus and so on, and actually witnessed the crucifixion and all this. All of these things first get mentioned in John. We've never heard of them before. None of the other Gospels say this. So I think that in and of itself is a big red flag that we're looking at someone whom John is making up. And then when we see where he's getting the idea and how it makes sense that his creation of this Lazarus character is a commentary on Luke, we fully understand now what he's doing in creating this Lazarus character. With regard to Simon of Cyrene, now there's a lot of cases where I believe there's symbolism in the Gospels where we don't have the sufficient background evidence to know exactly what's going on. So we have to be more speculative in some cases than in others. For example, we know there are much more elaborate stories about Romulus, for instance, about his incarnation, death, and resurrection. that we don't have. So there's a lot of times where the gospel authors could be commenting on things, texts and so forth, that we no longer have. So we can't necessarily be sure of the reconstructions. We can only catch the ones that are obvious, like the Barabbas narrative, the Cleopas narrative, the Lazarus narrative. I think those are cases where we have enough information to actually confirm the case. And so we created basically a prior probability. Once you have enough of these cases, the prior probability that any other story in the Gospels is also symbolism is very high. And so I think that in and of itself warrants further license in trying to figure out what the symbolism might be. Now, Simon of Cyrene is I think, a significant case of this, where I can tell you what I think Mark was doing, but we don't have the documents to know for sure because they're lost to us. We don't have a lot of the documentation from the ancient world. So I can only give you a hypothesis that's unprovable in my view. But then, so again, is the other hypothesis that he was an actual man with sons. We can't prove that hypothesis either. We don't have any particular evidence for it, despite certain archaeological finds that actually aren't statistically determinative of whether it was the actual Simon of Cyrene that we're talking about. But my speculation is, my hypothesis would be that, first of all, Simon is from Cyrene, which is the land beyond Egypt. It's on the other side of Egypt. So he's gone from the other side of Egypt all the way over to Jerusalem. Egypt was a common symbol of death. So in a sense, he's representing the way of death. And by being the father of two particularly famous people in the ancient world, Alexander the Great and Rufus, Musonius Rufus. Musonius Rufus was, in the Roman period, regarded as the second Socrates, and he had many moral teachings that were very similar to Jesus's. So in a sense, the commentary is that the way of Stoicism that Musonius Rufus represented is not the correct way, not the correct path to salvation. And the way of Alexander the Great, of seeking glory and conquest, is also not the way of salvation. And then what we have here is Simon of Cyrene, maybe the son of, or maybe the father of these things, but by picking up the cross of Jesus, he is actually representing the path to death that Jesus is going through. But of course, Jesus is going to represent salvation for those who actually accept his atoning sacrifice. Now, that's pure speculation. I agree. I mean, there's no way I can prove this or anything. It's the other cases that I presented here today and a few others that I think I can prove because the evidence is fairly clear. So all I can do is give you speculation like I did about that. And that's what I think. If it's not that, then I do think it's symbolism in some other respect that is lost to us because we don't have the documents.
Okay, let's go back over here for a question for Dr.
Okay.
Craig.
Dr. Lane, Dr. Carrier, central explanation for appearances was hallucinations. Given that hallucinations in psychoanalysis are held as individual events, how would you refute the fact that obviously we've had multiple individuals have the same hallucination? And wouldn't that be like me having a dream, going up to my friends in the morning and say, wow, what a dream we had last night. Let's pick it up tonight.
Well, in one sense, you're right, because since hallucinations are projections of a person's own mind, they cannot be literally shared because they are intra-mental. However, there are group hallucinations in the sense that there can be groups of people who imagine that they are seeing the same thing at the same time, and these are documented. So you can't rule it out absolutely, but I do think that what you have in the case of the Gospels is you have such diversity that it breaks all parallels in the psychological case books. The appearances appear not just to one person, but to many individuals, not just to individuals, but to groups of people, not just under one location and one set of circumstances, but at multiple locales and under a variety of circumstances, not just to believers, but also to unbelievers as well. And this kind of diversity simply can't be accommodated by the psychological theory of hallucinations. I think it renders it quite improbable, along with all of the other arguments against hallucinations that I mentioned.